Welcome, everybody. This is a peculiar aperitif of the Academy of Law and Migration. Usually aperitifs take place at 6 p.m. in Italy, but since we have very important guests from all over the world, we had to adjust our time, and therefore today we have this event at 2 o'clock Italian time, and we start now. I immediately leave the floor to Flora Di Donato, who will introduce our guests. We have a meeting on performing the nation's citizenship ceremonies in comparative focus. Flora, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Mario. I will leave first Manuela to do a more general introduction to the issue of citizenship, and then I will introduce our guests. Many thanks, Manuela.
Thank you, Flora. Thank you to all our speakers. I'm very glad to introduce just a few forwards because citizenship is a very specific topic, and usually when we approach it as thinking to the legal perspective, we have to focus both on the idea of participation and the idea of belonging. And if we try to face citizenship and the notion itself of citizenship according to those characteristics, we can see that a long history, because the historic perspective is very important under this specific topic. The different legal system developed in a different way by giving different, I would say, weight to sometime the idea of participation and sometime the idea of belonging. What today we will be able to analyze is how those aspects could somehow affect also the ceremonies that are, I would say, the final part of the recognition of the citizenship, but it's not only a formal part, but it could reveal the substantial aspect of what is intended by each state as being really citizenship. Today, we face many authors that are writing about also the boundaries of citizenship, what was the past, what will be the future. And by reading all the papers of our guests, what is very important is coming out, and it's quite peculiar, is that also the ceremony somehow reveal I would say, a sort of a mirror of the state that is recognizing the citizenship. So different views, the idea also of evaluating what could be the real value of the person who is becoming the new citizen. On the other side, the idea of protecting the population of the state by claiming somehow in some ceremonies more attention on security is revealed by ceremonies. So I really thank you, our speakers, because to me, and I think to many people who is attending today, your perspective is quite new and really quite interesting. So thank you very much. And I just leave the floor to you.
Many thanks, Manuela. My turn. I am very glad to introduce our guests, and I thank them very much for accepting our invitation. You saw their biographical information, so I will be very short. Sofya is a professor of sociology at CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies in New York. Bridget Byrne is professor of sociology at the University of Manchester and director of the Center of Dynamics of Ethnicity. And Macduff is a senior lecturer at the Australian National University College of Law. She's also a friend. Professors Aptekar, Byrne, and Dr. Macduff are going today to offer a unique picture of citizenship ceremonies in their different countries, Great Britain, United States and Australia, by analyzing the official speeches vehiculated within those ceremonies. In all these 3 countries, these colleagues explore how the speeches articulate narratives about migrants, national identity, and belonging. Drawing from different disciplinary background, I said before, sociological, legal, but I would add also anthropological, Bridget and Sofya research is real precious and rare, because usually researchers interested in migration and citizenship issues focus their attention on the administrative requirement for naturalization, the challenge experienced by the applicant by migrants, such as, for example, the interviews before the committees. In this case, the question that drive their investigations are different. One message about membership are vehiculated by the citizenship speeches. How do the speeches narrate the role of immigrants? To what extent is migration recognized as a resource or as a threat for the unity of the state? So by reading these 3 papers, it seems to me that a rhetoric of protection of the national state is recurrent, especially in Great Britain and the Australian ceremonies. The logic is to protect the identity of the nation state by emphasizing the loyalty and obedience of the immigrant, especially in the Australian paper. Perhaps US is an exception, especially after September 11. Sofya, for example, writes, surprisingly, foreigners are not only imagined as economic contributors to the nation, hard workers possessing skills, talents that will contribute to the prosperity of the nation, but they are depicted also as new cultural forces. Bridget, on her side, emphasized that this active vision or representation of immigrants' role in many British local communities is quite rare. So, more in general, we'll see, especially with on paper, that the legal narratives that derive from these rituals contribute to construct the identity of the community of the national state. These speeches convey a kind of legal order and establish legal categories, foreigners and citizens, you and us. So to summarize, and then I leave the floor to them, we can see a kind of tension between the representation of the immigrants as intrusive and disruptors of a consolidated equilibrium within the nation state, and their positive and active role as constructors of the host nation. So many thanks, and I ask to Bridget to start if she agrees.
Yes, great. Thank you very much. Could I be allowed to share a screen? Yes, thank you very much. I'm very sorry that I'm not able to be with you in Italy. That would have been lovely, but thank you for inviting me. I guess part of, I'm still not able to share my screen. It's been disabled. Ah, now I am. Great.
You should be able now.
Yeah, I can. Thank you. So part of the interest, I guess, is of the citizenship ceremonies is thinking about the ways in which early sociological accounts of globalization offered the prospect of the withering away of the state and the deterritorialization of citizenship. They suggested the figure of the global citizen who would move freely across the globe and make right claims based on universal human rights. But I guess I don't need to tell this audience that that hasn't come to pass, and that whilst people do move, or pre-COVID moved across the globe at a faster rate, these movements continue to be controlled by nation states. And perhaps COVID has made us particularly aware of that control of states. And what we've seen is that states are increasing their modes of surveillance and control over both citizens and aliens. National and regional laws and policy covering travel and migration have real effects. Passports, those national documents of identification, do matter. And people don't have equal access to international mobility. It's easier to cross some national borders than others, and many of the restrictions show the enduring power of European and Northern imperialism. So I kind of agree with Hannah Arendt that in the sphere of international law, it's true that sovereignty is nowhere more absolute than those matters of emigration, naturalization, nationality, and expulsion. Not all passports are equal. Different national passports offer very different possibilities of travel. At the same time, I'm very aware that not all bearers of national passports are equal. Increasingly, travelers are profiled by factors such as race, gender, place of birth, age, travel history, which leads to accelerated passage for some and through border zones and increasing scrutiny of others. So if we think about this question of citizenship of the nation state, it's crucial to people's lives, not just for enabling international movement, but also to secure rights for residents and political and social rights. So in this project, I was interested with that moment of the making of new citizens, not through birth in a particular territory and often as required to particular parents, but through the endowing of citizenship by the state on individuals who've not gained it by birth, but through migration, through that movement. They've moved towards their citizenship and obtained it, which is often shaped by a desire to stay because it gives rights of residence, but it's also accompanied by a desire to be able to move across national borders with more ease and assurance. So I was interested in this moment of the making of the new citizen because migrant subjects deeply implicated in the constitution of citizenship, of who counts and who does not. So looking at the case in the UK, that moment of creating citizenship ceremonies were introduced in the UK in 2004 as part of it was part of a whole suite of government policy of renewed attention to citizenship, arising out of concerns about immigration, integration, and what were proposed in public discourse as what was seen as the failure of multiculturalism. The ceremonies weren't developed in isolation, and that's why it's great to have this international panel. They took inspiration from those that former colonies, the United States, Canada, and Australia had been holding for many years, and which, particularly in the case of the US, are frequently represented in popular culture. And I was interested in the ceremonies because they're a moment at which the state creates a narrative, as Flora said, of what a citizen is, as well as suggesting how immigration regimes intersect with citizenship and the nation. So these public events can shed light on how the citizen is imagined and who or what forms of citizenship are excluded from or included in this imagining. So I feel that the rituals provide a rich source of narratives of nation and citizenship, what is told and not told in the ceremonies. The stories are told through the buildings in which they're held, in the symbols, flags, and portraits that are displayed, and the rituals that are created. And they're also told in oaths, pledges, or affirmations that are recited. And finally, they're told in the way the participants, those passing from being citizens to citizens, are addressed as part of a national community or separated from it. So I'm drawing here from my book, Making Citizens Public Rituals and Personal Journeys to Citizenship, which was published in 2014. And it was based in part on a comparison observation of citizenship ceremonies in the US, Canada, and Australia, the UK, the Netherlands, and Ireland. But the UK material was in much more depth, and that's what I'm focusing on today. I collected what were known as the welcome speeches from 47 ceremonies in the UK, and then I observed 10 ceremonies across the country, including some from Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, to try and, as well as England, to try and get that geographical and sub-national spread in the UK. And I also interviewed 30 people who were taking part in those ceremonies, as well as registrars who run them. about their experiences of migrating to the UK and what they thought about the ceremonies. But I'm going to focus here on those ceremonies themselves. Just to give the context of the ceremonies, the introduction of the new citizenship regime was accompanied by citizenship tests as well as the citizenship ceremony. And it was a product of ongoing political debates about the nature of Britishness and citizenship. And with those debates, of course, shaped the Brexit referendum and the exit process, which occurred after my research, but I think you can see the foreshadowings of it in some of it. So in these debates, politicians from the left and the right of the political spectrum in Britain have engaged in debates about the meaning of nationhood, often in the context of an argument about a supposed citizenship crisis. The concerns were frequently voiced that the British don't know what citizenship or Britishness means. The argument was present, for instance, in responses to civil disturbances in 2001 in the north of England and in the declared war on terror. Since the 7/7 bombings in London, there was increased focus on homegrown terrorists. The new Labour government under Tony Blair from 1997 proposed various solutions to this defined crisis, including the introduction of citizenship studies in schools in 2002, a biannual citizenship survey, which was begun in 2001, and then attention given to the endowing of citizenship to new British subjects. So this focus on new citizens needs to be understood as a contradictory move within British legislative policy at the time. On the one hand, the government, in a sense, was quite novel in arguing that immigration should be seen as potentially positive. That is where it was good for the economy. Yet it was accompanied by an increasing demonization of what was called unmanaged migration, and in particular of asylum seekers, who were increasingly classed as a kind of anti-citizen, and we see that debates continuing. In the context of the war on terror, the government also claimed the right to renege on some of the basic terms of the relationship between citizen and state. For instance, in the control orders in which state restricts individuals' mobility and subjects them to extra scrutiny without trial. And in the ways in which there have been moves to be able to remove citizenship from some who've been given it. Derek McGee argues that in the UK, there was a systemic dismantling of the multiculturalism as the organising rhetoric of public policies. And this is one of the context, if you like, for the ceremonies. Citizenship testing was introduced in the UK in 2005 with a test based on the book, The Life in the UK, A Journey to Citizenship, which was written by an advisor to the Labour government, who was also involved in reforming teaching of citizenship education. Passing the test was initially required for those applying for citizenship and then got pushed forward further in the process so that applicants for permanent residence are now required to pass the test. Initially, it was possible for those whose English was not good enough to opt to take an English test instead of the test, but this option has been withdrawn since October 2013. And everyone is required to demonstrate a good grasp of English by passing a language qualification as well as a knowledge test before being eligible for permanent residency. The tests, the content of the test has shifted over time. It has become a slightly political football, and there's more emphasis placed on British history and achievements rather than the knowledge required to live successfully within the UK. I'd argue that the citizenship or naturalisation tests serve as what Anne-Marie Fortier calls a technology of reassurance. It's not just that they restrict access to citizenship, but they're also a public statement that citizenship is not too easy, that that a high bar is placed on inclusion. Another potential technology of reassurance is the introduction of these ceremonies. In many cases, it seems that the ceremonies were designed to highlight not only the importance of citizenship, but also to provide reassurance that the creation of new citizens is accompanied not just by ritual, but also reminders of the citizens of their duties and responsibilities. The white paper that introduced, the government white paper that introduced the idea of the citizens put it this way. So arguing that we needed to copy from other countries and show that it will promote the value of naturalization and that immigrant groups welcome them. So the ceremonies were seen as a way of marking the acquisition of citizenship more formally, with a central prominence given to the pledge, taking an oath or pledge of allegiance. The ceremonies are organised by local registrars and take place in register offices and town halls. And registrars are generally the people you go to get married, to register deaths. And so they're kind of there in key life events. Some are organised, however, in different locations, such as schools, libraries and museums. As I said, register offices are the site of the official marking of other life events, more traditionally birth, death and marriage. And also at the same time, or the year later, civil partnership ceremonies were introduced. So these ceremonies mark a significant extension in the function of local borough and county register officers. All ceremonies include what's called a local welcome, and the white paper introduced the idea of citizenship ceremonies, placed emphasis on this aspect. It stresses that ceremonies should be based in local communities, and that register officers and local council officials involved in the ceremony were told to make a welcome speech, but were given no instruction on the content of it. So it was open to them to decide how to do it, giving the events a local character. Although actually my observation of the 10 ceremonies around the country suggested there's quite a lot of uniformity in how they're conducted. It was, however, I think an interesting move to place the ceremonies outside the direct role of the UK Border Agency, who are the people who deal with the applications for citizenship and for immigration, meaning that the ceremonial aspect of endowing citizenship would be provided by professionals who are used to providing a sense of occasion and welcome rather than a government agent, which it's likely that many would-be citizens would associate with unwelcome scrutiny and the culture of disbelief, which characterises a lot of their engagement. The introduction of citizenship ceremonies has involved an expansion of those staff members' time and has become a source of income for them because the new citizens pay for their own welcomes. Alongside these registrars, a wide range of other officials are involved in the local welcomes, and here's a photograph from one of the ceremonies. There are both elected representatives, such as city councillors, and unelected officials, such as the Lord Lieutenants or provosts, who are sort of honorary people officially appointed by the Queen, who have largely ceremonial roles. So in this photo, you have on the left would be the mayor of the particular town or city, and on the right is one of these Lord Lieutenants, who you can note their kind of military garb, which is a kind of fantasy uniform. They have little stirrup. I can't remember what they're called, the little thing at the back of your boots to prong a horse. You know, they have this very elaborate military outfit, and you often see mayors, and you can also see the kind of national regalia in the background. There are sometimes some local registrars a bit more creative in terms of who comes. There might be local figures, even radio DJs, who are there because of their interest in the subject of immigration, or because they are they promote positive views of immigration. Sometimes they've asked new citizens, even such as an academic from a new local university, who's been through the ceremony to come back and give the welcome speech. But generally it's these registrars and these officials, such as the Lord Lieutenant and High Sheriff. And as you see, they're wearing these quasi-military dress. They often are very dressed up. There's always a portrait of the Queen Elizabeth displayed in the room, and they're sent a list of suitable portraits. They have to use one of the official ones. So these symbols of national identity are centrally controlled. And I would suggest that the display of these costumes alongside the portrait of the Queen clearly adds to the symbolism of nation and royalty, but it sits very oddly, in a sense, next to assertions of the importance of democracy in Britain and the equality of all citizens, which are important parts of the ceremonies. These uniforms are dress ceremonies which are purposefully old-fashioned and can appear anachronistic. Those who have ceremonial role will often begin their speech by explaining that they are speaking on behalf of the Queen as her representative, and the national anthem is played at the ceremony. In terms of the oath, participants choose to take a religious or a non-religious oath of allegiance, so they can avoid or choose to avoid God, but there's no avoidance of God in the national anthem when it's played. In Britain, the oath or affirmation is introduced with the explanation from the set text. I'm now going to ask you to make promises and swear or affirm an oath to the sovereign that you will be a faithful citizen, and I will ask you to make a formal and public pledge that you will be a loyal subject and observe the laws of the country. These representations of citizenship, while placed within the local context in the UK speeches, remain focused on abstract notions of citizenship, and also largely at the level of the nation state, with, as we shall see, some reference to local or city identities. While the ceremonies are designed to reflect both local and national in Britain, which includes reference to the nations of Scotland, Wales and Ireland within the UK state, European identity, even long before Brexit, was not appealed to. I haven't observed the ceremony since Brexit, but what was most interesting to me at the time was the almost total lack of European symbols, or indeed the almost total absence of any reference to European citizenship in the speeches or other parts of the ceremonies. This was despite the fact that for many interviewees, of course, those taking new citizenship, it was an important part of applying for British citizenship. It was that it meant at the time obtaining European citizenship. So in a sense, those ceremonies don't need to have changed much following the UK's departure from the European Union. But it makes British citizenship arguably less valuable in those terms, although it's also likely that there will be many more European citizens who are choosing to go through these processes to secure their status in the UK. I'm going to briefly think about the speeches in these local welcomes, which have been envisaged as part of the ceremony. And I'm interested in the notion of the local welcome because of the kind of performative dilemma that it sets up. Can you be welcoming just by saying welcome? And more significantly, what does it mean to claim a history of welcoming, which was commonly part of the ceremonies? So again, going back to the original white paper, the idea of the ceremonies were a technology of reassurance. It was to enable integration, but also to ensure that people take on commitments in order to then receive the welcome they deserve. So we can see here in the paper that the welcome is already to a certain extent qualified. The mere act of claim of welcoming, and I would argue the mere act of claiming a welcome is not the same as an actual act of welcome. Welcomes and hospitalities can be eroded by the idea that too many conditions rest on them, and they can be undermined by an account of local or national history, which silences more contentious issues and experiences. In addition, many of the speeches contained what might be seen simply as touristic guides to the local area, which I think were interesting because the ways they position new citizens as newcomers to the area, ignoring the fact that the regulations governing the acquisition of citizenship mean it generally requires several years of residence before the citizenship applications can be made. So the touristic descriptions, I would argue, serve to inhibit the presentation of new citizens as fellow locals. And the idea of the welcome in itself potentially creates this position of guests and host, inhabitant and newcomer, and makes space for judgments as to who should be offered that hospitality. One of the features of the speeches that I noticed, or that are the 47 speeches that I analysed, was that they often have a notion of what is called deep England or rural Britain or deep Britain. by Ian Wright. These speeches appear to be laying claim to the heart of the nation through landscape and the rural landscape, which is not where the majority of immigrants live and necessarily feel very comfortable. But it also suggests a notion of an unchanging narrative, of an unchanging nation that that is free in some senses of culture. As Ernest Gellner notes, nations like Everest must be presented as ancient and always there. So of the 25 texts out of the total of 47 which mention history, 19 referred to pre-Norman history, ranging from Neolithic, Bronze Age and Iron Age through to Saxon, Vikings and Danes. And most often the Romans. You'll be glad to hear that the Roman influence is strongly mentioned. So here are two examples of making allusions to that ancient history. Although I'd argue that in the second quote, there's a slightly unhappy link, if you like, made from early Roman invaders to then talking about people coming to Britain as immigrants. And it's an awkward account. But this dramatic jump from a very ancient history to the present day immigration was really quite common and quite surprising. I think I'm running slightly out of time, but I'm going to just give a couple of quotes. So there was a claim of welcome, which I would argue was slightly inhibited by that position of who the we is that is welcoming you. But I just want to leave you with a quote from one of the people I interviewed who'd taken part in the ceremony. And I asked all of them, well, they make a big deal about welcoming you to Britain and often claim that Britain has been, well, or this area, Manchester or wherever, has been welcoming immigrants for a long time. And how did people feel that they had been welcomed when they arrived to Britain? And this is one example of one of the respondents, a new citizen, who explains that no, and they often were a bit awkward in expressing this, but actually they hadn't felt welcome when they first came to Britain, and that they had, particularly if they were racialized as non-white, they often felt quite extreme degrees of hostility, depending on where they lived. And so I would argue that the speeches that refused to acknowledge that lack of welcome, if you like, were undermining the ways in which they could be incorporating the experiences of the new citizens. But I'll leave it there. Sorry, I need to now stop sharing. I'll come back. How do I stop sharing? Sorry. Here we go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bridget, for this heart picture. And it seems to me that there is a clear tendency toward assimilation of the foreigners. And also many thanks for these last passages about the feeling of the people and how do they feel in the relationship with the locals. So I guess that multiculturalism is also a reason for this tendency toward assimilation. So it's normally we could imagine that countries such as Great Britain, US, and also Switzerland, which are made of foreigners, could be facilitated in daily life in dealing with these differences. But in the fact, it's quite the contrary. So maybe we can discuss after of these difficulties in everyday life during the debate. I propose to leave the floor to Anne, if you agree. Many thanks.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Thank you to Flora and Manuela and Mario. And thank you also to Bridget for an amazing paper to kick us off with. Really interesting. So I'm just going to now also try and work out how to share my screen. Okay. Can you see that okay? Australian citizenship ceremonies, is that excellent? Okay, so I'd like to begin, as you might be aware, many Australians do, by acknowledging the Indigenous custodians of the land upon which I live and work. In Canberra, that's the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri peoples, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I acknowledge that sovereignty over the Australian continent was never ceded. As a non-Indigenous person, acknowledging which of the over 350 Indigenous nations that I live on is one important way that I recognise my privilege as a first-generation Australian working in a law school in a colonised land where there are ongoing challenges arising from that initial dispossession. It's an important part of an ongoing conversation in contemporary Australia, and although I have a very international audience, I still felt it was important to start with that. So my presentation today will analyse citizenship ceremonies conducted in Australia, and I'll explore the narratives that they convey about, well, the ones I think they convey about citizenship, national identity and migration. And like Bridget, I'll not only touch upon the texts of the speeches that are made during those ceremonies, but also consider the broader context and the rituals in which that ceremony is performed as a whole. So I was going to start by briefly explaining some of the features of Australian citizenship ceremonies. The reasons for my interest in the area and my motivations actually parallel quite nicely with Bridget, and Bridget's given a fantastic introduction for her, but also I'll park that for the moment, but happy to talk about that more later. So I'll dive into an explanation of some of the features of that ceremony. And in particular, I want to highlight some of its unique features. In particular, its detailed regulation. And as a lawyer coming to it, that was one of the reasons that it drew me to it. And I think it's something that's been understated by and large and not noticed. And then I'll talk about how those ceremonies construct as visual narratives. I think of migrants as threats, which is quite interesting, given that Australia has in the past positioned itself as a nation of immigration. But I feel now the way the messages that are being communicated by citizenship ceremonies really do focus on migrants as threats to Australian national identity. And while they are able to acquire Australian citizenship, they do that only on a conditional and fairly precarious basis, agreeing to ongoing scrutiny and surveillance. So to begin then, just a very brief overview of the ceremony. By way of background, the Australian citizenship ceremony is officially described as a public ceremonial occasion. It's usually conducted by local councils throughout Australia, and they are considered to be, and I quote, an important opportunity to formally welcome new citizens as full members of the Australian community. And in a key official document, the Australian government says this about citizenship ceremonies in particular. So this is on the slide. To reflect the significance of the occasion, citizenship ceremonies should be formal and meaningful occasions conducted with dignity, respect and ceremony. They should be designed to impress upon conferees the responsibilities and privileges of Australian citizenship. The formality and the dignity of the ceremony is conveyed through the explicit use of ritual and symbolism, some of which borrowed, as we'll see in a minute, from the UK. A brief description of a typical ceremony outlines many of these important elements. So I have some images for you. So candidates or conferees enter and are seated before a stage or podium. The person conducting the ceremony in Australia is called the presiding officer, and they usually speak from a stage or behind the podium. On display is the official portrait of the Queen, the Australian coat of arms, and the Australian national and state flags. The presiding officer is usually a government official, in contrast to being a registrar, and they are usually they could be either a local, state, territory, or federal government official. After welcoming everyone, the presiding officer reads aloud a speech that has been prepared by the minister. So if you go to It is updated from time to time, but you can read that speech by the minister, and it is read word for word by the presiding officer. Then the presiding officer and any invited dignitaries might give a short speech, and invited guests could include Indigenous elders who could conduct a welcome to country. The main activity or the focus of the ceremony is where the candidates stand and recite the Pledge of Commitment. That's its terminology instead of an oath of allegiance. And they recite that after the presiding officer. The text of the Australian pledge is as follows. From this time forward, you can choose to take the pledge under oath or by affirmation. I pledge my loyalty to Australia and its people, whose democratic beliefs I share, whose rights and liberties I respect, and whose laws I will uphold and obey. So once the presiding officer verifies that the conferees have recited the pledge, they have a pledge verification list that they have to sign off. So they need to make sure they've seen the conferees at least mouth the words, because you couldn't hear them individually if there are a large number of them. The certificates are then often distributed. Individuals or family groups are often asked to walk onto the stage to receive their certificates, and often invited to shake hands with the presiding officer and any dignitaries. And sometimes a photo is taken to mark the occasion. To conclude the ceremony, the Australian national anthem is sung and refreshments often follow. The citizenship ceremony, as I've just described it, has many features used in many other formal public ceremonies, which serve to highlight that this is a particular achievement that is to be socially valued. From awards nights to school assemblies and graduations, the pattern of entering, being seated, listening, receiving a document, shaking hands, celebrating with applause, consuming refreshments is a well-known ritual of celebration in Western culture. The achievement that the citizenship ceremony celebrates is, of course, membership in the Australian national community. Many speeches note that this is from this moment that the conferee can now truly call themselves Australian. I'll now turn to an important, but I think largely unnoticed aspect of Australian citizenship ceremonies, and that is to how highly regulated they are. Not entirely obviously, but certainly you don't have to scratch very low beneath the surface to see it. And then I'll reflect on what that regulation, that tight regulation and control achieves. So citizenship ceremonies were introduced alongside the status of citizenship in 1949 in Australia. Since that time, local councils, they had initially had quite considerable discretion to conduct the ceremonies as they saw fit, as long as they provided or they facilitated the pledge. They could certainly tailor their views and speeches to include ideas about citizenship, migration and national identity, which reflected local views, interests and priorities. Today, by contrast, the federal government not only sets out the legal requirements for the ceremony, but it also sets out detailed expectations about the way the ceremony ought to be performed. And it does this in a detailed 50-page document called the Australian Citizenship Ceremonies Code. And the slide has the front page of that, of the current edition. The code outlines many features that I have already outlined about the ceremony. So the vision of the ceremony outlined in this code, I think effectively limits the abilities of conferees to express their own experiences and meanings of citizenship. Throughout the ceremony, the actions of conferees are directed by the presiding officer. The conferees do not move or even speak independently. The conferees stand when they're invited to do so, instructed to repeat back the words of the pledge in unison with others, and then asked to sit. Perhaps their only choices in terms of their actions is whether or not to take their pledge under God, so to swear or to make an affirmation, and or whether they shake hands with the presiding officers, or perhaps they decide not to have their photo taken. The vision of the ceremony outlined in the code also limits the opportunities that the presiding officer has to express alternative or local meanings about Australian citizenship. They must read, as I've mentioned, aloud the pre-prepared speech from the minister. They must read aloud the preamble of the Citizenship Act. While they do have some scope to make their own speeches, the code provides considerable direction as to the content, tone, and length of those speeches. And the code also identifies some content that they should not raise and not include in their speeches. And if they, and to top it all off, if they depart from the content as recommended by the code, then the federal government could, or it has capacity to withdraw their authorisation from either the local council or the particular official from conducting citizenship ceremonies at all. And this has actually happened. So the code as it is currently written suggests that the ceremony ought to be conducted at least twice a year, once on Australia Day and once on Citizenship Day. However, a number of local councils around Australia have indicated that they do not want to hold citizenship ceremonies on Australia Day. This decision has been made in the context of what in Australia is known as the Change the Date movement, which is a push to recognise that although the 26th of January is a date when the British government claimed the colony of Australia as its own, it was also the date where Australia's Indigenous peoples were dispossessed. Some local councils have therefore declared that out of respect for their Indigenous peoples, that Australia Day is not a date of celebration, and therefore they choose not to hold citizenship ceremonies on that day. However, there are about 5 local councils around Australia, which is not many, but still, these councils have been removed from the government's list of authorised councils, and they are not permitted to conduct citizenship ceremonies at all. And that's still the case. So this tight official regulation, perhaps, is a reasonably unique feature of Australian citizenship ceremonies. The development of the code and its detailed expectations contained within it also suggests that the ceremony currently plays a very critical part in securing an official, centralised and state-endorsed meaning of citizenship within Australia. So in my final section of the paper, I wanted to explore a little about what this tightly scripted performance of citizenship conveys about migration and migrants and national identity. So first, I think it's important, and it's not unusual by any stretch, to say that, or to note that in Australia as elsewhere, only those acquiring naturalisation, in Australian, it's called citizenship by conferral. We like to have our own labels for things, it appears, are required to attend citizenship ceremonies and make the pledge. Others, so citizens who, people who acquire citizenship by birth or descent don't need to attend any ceremony at all, and they're not required to take any pledge. There is also no other context or social situation where the words of the pledge is made. So it's not made at school assemblies, and it's not made by any person accepting any national title or office. So therefore, migrants are the only group who must perform citizenship in this way. A migrant's expressed desire to become Australian, even if they satisfy all the other legislative criteria, is just not sufficient. Instead, it's the performance of the pledge in a public and official ceremony that is absolutely necessary before that they are recognised as legal members in the Australian community. I'm interested to ask, well, why is this additional step necessary? What is it about the way that Australia represents migrants that makes that so? And I'd argue that it's by that requiring only migrants to attend the ceremony and take the pledge is a way of distinguishing them as a unique group. And by creating an additional hurdle, it communicates doubts about their commitment and about their capacity to be citizens at all. Therefore, while the ceremony does celebrate membership, which is what the state officials claim, it simultaneously and perhaps paradoxically casts doubts over the ability of migrants to be Australian citizens in the first place. And I think these doubts are amplified by a growing trend over the last decade to increase the number of witnesses at Australian citizenship ceremonies. while citizenship ceremonies are, as in the UK, often held in town halls, they are increasingly, they've increasingly started to be held in outdoor places like parks and gardens. And admittedly, the weather in Australia is perhaps nicer to do that. But the code also encouraged councils to not only hold them outside, but to hold them outside at times when other festivals and community events are likely to be happening. So, the purpose of that being in order to draw in passing crowds. So, and even to an even greater extent, the code explains how local councils can invite and use the local media to advertise the citizenship ceremonies to coincide with those festivals in order to bring in even more of the public to be witnesses of the event. And even more recently, we've had the citizenship ceremonies live streamed, so that now that they can be brought into everybody's living room. This enhances the probability that large crowds will witness migrants making their pledges and participating in their ceremonies. It ensures that the performance of citizenship by migrants can be witnessed by a very broad national audience. And I think a related or a correlative of that is it subjects to migrants to an even more intense public gaze and scrutiny. Certainly by making the pledge, at least some of the suspicions that are potentially raised are also assuaged. And as has been raised in the UK context, the citizenship ceremony could function in Australia as a means through which an additional technology of reassurance, a way of creating an additional hurdle that makes the national public feel as if that citizenship is not too easy to get, and reassures that public by going, okay, so that's then made a deserving migrant. And while I think that's true and operative in Australia, so too is by creating that additional hurdle, what I think has happened is that it serves to remind the public that that additional hurdle is needed, that they need to be additionally tested and scrutinised in order to meet the standard of whatever it is they feel an Australian citizen might be. And once these suspicions have been renewed, I think they're not contained within the performance of the ceremony itself, and that they extend beyond and into our public life. And I think this has occurred in Australia, and how what I've noticed, and I'll show you a quote in a moment, is how increasingly the behaviour of migrants is criticised and evaluated according to their failure to uphold the pledge. So here is a statement that one of our members of parliament made in the passage of a bill on citizenship, and he writes, or he said, I think the only way in which we can influence those who we want to subvert or change Australia to their own form of dictatorship or dominance is to have them understand that most Australians really do know what this country stands for. The only way in which that can be achieved is through the Citizenship Act, and by having the Citizenship Act as the basis for understanding. If somebody who has taken the oath seeks to corrupt or ignore, they become answerable to the processes of law. The public context of migrants making the pledge, I think, then creates a sense that membership is conditional on the ongoing performance of this promise, which they make in the pledge and the ceremony. And this creates, I think, or I suggest, different classes of citizenship in Australia, with citizens by conferral or naturalisation, which is how you would know them, under an additional level of scrutiny about their loyalty. And I think that has justified still further restrictions in citizenship law, and a still stronger urge in public and political discourse tying citizenship and loyalty together. So this next statement appears in the explanatory memorandum of a bill that expanded the basis upon which dual and multiple citizens could have their Australian citizenship removed the political context was Australian dual and multiple citizens fighting in Syria and returning home, and the risk of them being radicalised. But the way that the legislation was worded was to capture a much wider range of people than that. And as I could leave it up, that loyalty becomes really key. So to finish, I just want to make 3 final comments. Do I have time? I'm not sure if I have time.
A few minutes.
How many?
A couple of minutes.
Okay? A couple. Okay. Yeah, that's okay. All right. So just 3. And I'm hoping to bring in perhaps some of the threads that Bridget has already raised, and perhaps Sofya will follow up with. So the Australian citizenship ceremony incorporates many distinctly Australian symbols, but it also draws, as you will have seen, on British tradition to imbue a relatively young legal status of 70 years with some significance. To that end, I think the symbols and rituals of a British colonial past continue to be used in Australian citizenship ceremonies, such as the Queen, the flag, which still contains the Union Jack, and even the regalia of some of the mayors, you will have noticed, look perhaps not quite so extravagant as the ones Bridget showed, but still they have that clear cultural connection. Using historical tradition, however, to secure the legitimacy of the Australian nation and its membership is problematic, because if you overemphasise the value of history, after all, what is the weight of a 250-year-old colonial history as compared to the 40,000-year-old civilization of our First Nations people, conservatively estimated? Secondly, the degree of official control and oversight in Australia is not only much more significant today than I think when citizenship ceremonies were introduced 70 years ago, it's much more significant, I suspect, than in other countries. It appears that Australia, through the meaning of secures the meaning of citizenship largely in and through legislation, or through the language and appeal to the law. Perhaps this is due to a lack of national legitimacy acquired through historical or cultural connections. Perhaps I'll have to think about that some more in the future. I'm happy to have a chat about that if other people have ideas. And finally, the narratives about migrants that are being conveyed through citizenship ceremonies in Australia, I would argue that they're not being narrated at the moment, at least, although perhaps they once were, as super citizens, and nor are they narrated as deserving migrants. I think instead they are being positioned or represented as conditionally accepted, provided that they exhibit ongoing loyalty and allegiance. Cultural diversity, very sad to say, I don't think is valued and a visible part of our official meaning of Australian citizenship. And the only extent that cultural diversity is recognised, it's a part of the conferee's unchangeable past, perhaps where they came from, but not something that's going to reflect where they're going, and certainly something that they'll need to keep private and not reflected in their public life of citizenship. So that is it. Thank you very much for your patience. I'll pass the floor back to, I'm not sure if it's either Flora, Manuela, or on to Sofya. Stop sharing this.
Yes. So many thanks. It seems to me that the rhetoric of obedience is really explicit in the Australian system. So maybe after we can back to the difference between the British and the Australian system that ask even to interiorize laws and values. So it's really far from a liberalist approach. So thank you, and I propose to Sofya to launch the presentation and share the screen.
Great, and thanks so much for having me. These 2 presentations were really fascinating, since I'm really into citizenship ceremonies too. So I'm trying to get back into thinking about the US context. Let me share my screen. You all can see Yes, thank you. So I'm joining you from New York City, which is a traditional unceded territory of the Lenape people. And I am going to talk about citizenship ceremonies in the American context in the US. And what I will try to cover quickly, so we have time to talk, is just some basics about the requirements for US citizenship, the benefits of US citizenship, some trends in the take-up of citizenship, and then of course I'll talk about the ceremonies, which to me are one of the most fascinating parts of the whole process. So starting with the requirements, we in the United States, we have residency requirements that are 5 years of permanent legal residency or 3 years if you're married to US citizens. And there are no residency requirements basically if you're serving in the military. Applicants for citizenship have to pass a civics test and demonstrate a command of English. And this is, unlike another context, is done one-on-one in an interview with an immigration officials. And they also have to demonstrate good moral character, which is actually an extremely long list of things that can disqualify you, including things that are not specified and that just the immigration officer deciding that you have a failure of good moral character. But the range of give you a taste of what kinds of things that could be. It could be fraudulent voting. It could be being a habitual drunkard or a prostitute. I'm using the words that are on the official forms. A member of the Communist Party, and some like pages and pages of things that could disqualify you. And of course, the biggest obstacle for folks getting to this part of the process is actually becoming permanent legal residents. There are many, many hurdles, and it's impossible for a lot of immigrants to even get there. So this is just for people who had permanent legal residence. Some of the benefits of acquiring US citizenships are ability to travel more easily, political rights like voting and running for office, family reunification. So US citizens are more easily able to sponsor the migration of their family members. Job opportunities, some jobs in the US are reserved for citizens, most jobs in law enforcement, for example, so it's not just jobs that require security clearance and government contracts, which also require US citizenships. And perhaps most importantly, it's protection for deportation. So in an era of mass deportations, US citizenship, unlike permanent residency, does protect immigrants from being detained in immigration detention and deported. So what we have been seeing for several decades now is defensive naturalization, where immigrants are acquiring US citizenship in order to feel safer and more secure in this kind of what we call war on immigrants context. So just to give you a sense of the numbers of people we're talking about, recent years, it's as many as 700,000 people acquiring US citizenship per year. The take-up in terms of percentages is quite low compared to other countries. So for a long time, it was less than half of eligible people becoming US citizens. It is higher now, more in the 60s, but still remains quite low compared to many other countries. So I already mentioned the war on immigrants, and I want to talk a bit about how naturalization fits into the context of the war on immigrants. So since the formation of Department of Homeland Security after September 11th attack, naturalization has really shifted at becoming the last opportunity to detain and deport immigrants. So a lot of even the personnel that are doing the interviews and managing that naturalization process used to work in more, relatively more punitive arms of the system, like doing customs at the airport or working on the border. And so they bring that mentality to the naturalization process. And it's really kind of the last chance for the immigration system to find some irregularity, 10, 20 years before in the immigrant's file, and someone who comes in thinking they're going to get naturalized then loses their status and can become deported and detained and deported. It's also a way to entrench securitization and surveillance that pervades the system as a whole. So the naturalization process itself is part of the punitive and criminalized immigration, where applicants submit to considerable and extensive surveillance and scrutiny as part of the process. And there are considerable risks to going through the process, which is also partly why the take-up is not as high as you would imagine given the benefits. It's also expensive. So my colleagues have not mentioned, figures in terms of how much it costs to become naturalized, but in the US, even without any attorney fees, the fees themselves are almost $1,000 just for the application. So it's a considerable obstacle. And of course, naturalization is an important legitimating spectacle for the US nation. It's, as my colleagues have mentioned, it's often in the media. In the US, we're like familiar with the image of, large groups of immigrants with their hands raised up, taking the oath. And it's really framed as the happy side of our immigration system. The spectacle is used to support a vision of the United States as a nation of immigrants, multicultural, egalitarian, meritocratic, and it counteracts a lot of other visuals. So we have a lot of other visuals that it, kind of counterposed with, most recently U.S. Border Patrol agents on horseback, with whips chasing Haitian refugees, Central American children in prisons. So partly why we have in the U.S. so much of this imagery of naturalization ceremony is to counteract some of these other images about how the U.S. immigration system works. And in a post 9/11 context, it became extremely important as a spectacle, and explicitly so when you listen to the speeches made at these ceremonies, because the naturalization ceremonies were said to show the world that people from all over the world love the United States so much that here they are becoming part of it. And they say that they hate us, but look at this, right? So it's an extremely important part of kind of nationalist narratives. Right? And so it culminates in these naturalization ceremonies that are quite old, right? Unlike the two cases that we heard about. They started in the early 20th century, in some ways in a similar context to what Anne and Bridget described, over concerns over immigrant assimilation and cheapening of citizenship. The government doubled down during the Red Scare and the anti-communist hunts after World War II, institutionalizing these ceremonies. It's something that all immigrants have to go through to acquire citizenship. And there's with 700,000 becoming naturalized every year, there's a lot of ceremonies, and they range from really routine. Some immigration offices have 2 ceremonies a day, every day. And they go all the way to like really massive ceremonies. So there's some ceremonies with 4,000, 5,000 new citizens at once, held in giant sports stadiums. And they are, speaking of Australia Day, that was fascinating. And they are often like done especially for holidays, but these holidays in the US that they do them for are things like Citizenship Day, which no one celebrates or knows about, and were created during the Cold War, to whip up like nationalist sentiment, and still remain with us today somehow in 2021, where they announce, like 500 simultaneous citizenship ceremonies on Citizenship Day. And they also have them for Veterans Day, holidays like that. In terms of what they look like, they're explicitly like school graduations. So, ceremonies to finish high school or college, they're very much like that in form and in feel, and in the elements, symbolic elements of standing up and sitting down and, processing across the stage, handshakes, receiving certificates, posing with certificates. There's many, elements that they share with school graduations. And what actually legally makes you a US citizen is the oath of allegiance, which, unlike my colleagues, I will not put up on the screen because it's super long and extremely archaic language, because our ceremonies is so much older. But basically what the new citizens are promising to do is to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, bear true faith and allegiance to the constitutions, renounce allegiance to a whole long list of things, including other states. And then there's three options. There are options for conscientious objectors. So you can either swear to bear arms on behalf of the US or perform non-combatant service, but in the military. Or if you're a conscientious objector, you can say that you will perform work of national importance under civilian direction. One thing that we have that I'm not sure is present in the UK and Australia is all ceremonies include a video address by whoever happens to be the current president. So all the presidents, I think the last 5 presidents have made this video address, and it's shown the same, like 2-minute speeches that are shown to all the people becoming US citizens. And that is kind of the only common thread, because they're quite local, just like it sounds like in the other contexts that we've discussed. And the local officials have a lot of leeway in terms of how they organize or what is said. So I'm currently working on the US military and immigrants in the US military, so I'm particularly interested in on the militarization of US citizenship. There are special provisions in the US that give expedited citizenship to immigrants who serve in the military. And since about 15 years ago, there are naturalization ceremonies that are done on US bases abroad. And, US has 800, 900 bases across the world. And these military ceremonies are like our regular naturalization ceremonies, but on steroids in terms of legitimating the US. Because not only are you showing foreigners who want to be part of the United States, these are foreigners who are willing to die for the United States. So it's like legitimation squared that's happening. And of course, it's a way to whitewash US empire and hide the fact that many of these immigrant soldiers are in the United States because the US military displaced their families and communities, and they're exchanging citizenship for military service. And the exchange of citizenship for military service in the United States has been part of our history for hundreds of years, and it is part of the militarization of US citizenship. All right, and so I also definitely want to talk about, like my colleagues, about the speeches that I made at the citizenship ceremonies in the United States. So for almost 80 years, ceremonies have to have someone who gives a speech to new citizens. So in 1940, US Congress passed a joint resolution calling for a judge or another designated individual to, quote, address the newly naturalized citizens upon the form and genius of our government and the privileges and responsibilities of citizenship, it being the intent and purpose of this section to enlist the aid of the judiciary in cooperation with civil and educational authorities and patriotic organizations in a continuous effort to dignify and emphasize the significance of citizenship. So again, this was amidst, concerns about, communists and anarchists, infiltrators, lots of political denaturalizations and deportations, and emphasis on needing to instill in immigrants the value of US citizenship. So there is a speaker at all the ceremonies, and it really is, sometimes it is the judge presiding over the ceremony, or the head of the immigration office, or local government official. Sometimes it is faculty at local colleges. It is really, very minor B and C celebrities. It's really a range of speakers. And in my research, I analyze, like my colleagues, I analyze what is said in these speeches. And I was interested in the historical shift in these ceremony speeches. So I was able to find some from the mid-20th century and compare them to more recent speeches. And what I document in my work is a shift in the way that immigrants are portrayed in these speeches. And the shift is from being portrayed as a liability, you know, potential spies, kind of a weak link, to really incredible discourse of super citizen. Like, not only are immigrants contributing to the United States, but they're showing the United States what it means to be a citizen. It is really over the top, especially considering the realities of the immigration enforcement and system at the time that these speeches are happening. So I'll give you a taste of what I'm talking about. This is the first speech is from the 50s, and it says, as new citizens, you may be subject to attempts by enemies of our government to enlist you in their cause. These elements, in my opinion, are radicals of both the right, including those similar to the Nazis and fascists on the one hand, and those of the left, including the communists. My advice to you is scrupulously to avoid either extreme and to pursue a middle course, one which is liberal and yet with a view to preserving all of our ways of life with due regard, not only to personal rights, but also the rights of property. That's super important. The middle course, my friends, in my opinion, is the closest to the American way of life. Right. So then the relationship that the speaker has to the immigrants in front of him as they're becoming citizens is one of like suspicion and potential disloyalty. And contrast that to a recent speech in 2007 in Massachusetts by just a local judge. You see, this land is now your land. And so much for native land, right? And so when I say welcome to you, to the great public office of citizen, I must tell you that you honor us greatly. You are making us safer and stronger by choosing to join us in that high public office. So I thank you again for the honor that you have bestowed upon this country by accepting the highest public office that we have to offer. So they're thinking the new citizens. And there's also, you know, there's a lot more obviously to these speeches, but in the later speeches, there's also more, you know, honor your culture and acknowledgement of cultural diversity, and so on. So there's this kind of important shift. And what I argue is that the shift happens in part because the immigration system and the kind of the imaginary of immigrants bifurcates by this later period into quote unquote illegals and those who wait in line, right? And so the ones that are addressed in these ceremonies are presented as super citizens because there's implicit comparison to the bad immigrants, right? Those who cross the border illegally who are criminals. And so they ramp up the super citizen discourse to contrast it and legitimate the immigration system and the way that it works by presenting these immigrants as the good, deserving immigrants. And the last observation that I'll make about these speeches is there is a pervasive nature of erasure of US settler colonial history and ongoing present. So it's very common in these ceremonies to hear in the speeches that the United States is a nation of immigrants, and this is done to an absurd extent. So not only the immigrants, you know, the early European immigrants I mentioned, but the settler colonists are called immigrants, right? The African slaves are called immigrants. And most absurdly, the indigenous people of the land are also called immigrants because they're said to have crossed over from Asia thousands of years ago. So everybody becomes an immigrant, and any kind of distinction in those experiences is erased. In this kind of discourse in which immigrants are complicit hides the reality the United States is founded on slavery and genocide, and that it continues to dispossess indigenous people, and that it is an empire that's complicit in the displacement of people across the world, many of whom become migrants and then end up in these ceremonies if they're lucky, right? And citizenship ceremonies are a very powerful nationalist tool of legitimation for the US empire. So I want to make sure we have time to have discussion, so that'll be it for me.
So many thanks, Sofya, for this wonderful picture. I have the feeling that the debate here is less focused on obedience and not on securitization on somewhere. And also on the need to make connections between the state and immigrants stronger. Is the citizenship conceived as a step, a further step toward integration, or is it arrives at the end of a journey of integration as in the Australian and British system? Maybe you can answer after. We can collect other questions, I don't know if there are other possible comments from our participants. Mario.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I think each of them was particularly interesting for an Italian scholar who does not know how ceremonies actually take place in different legal orders. But it was also interesting to compare the different varieties of ceremonies in the three legal orders that you were referring to in your presentation. Now, I will try to make few remarks and questions dealing in turn with each of the paper and presentation. I will start with Bridget and her presentation on the UK. I also went through her paper. So my question here concerns, on one hand, the absence of reference to the European Union and to membership of the EU, also before Brexit, and therefore also when once upon a time the new British citizen became also European citizen. So it's a remarkable absence, and therefore on one hand we have this element, no mention of membership of the EU. On the other hand, we have a devolution of responsibility for designing the ceremonies to local government. Is there, in your understanding, any connection between these two trends, decentralizing trends, I would say? May the long-standing British tradition of self-government at local level have had relevance here? This is my question to Bridget. Now I turn to Anne. My observation concerns the main argument I got from your paper. I like the idea that national values mentioned in the citizenship oath may convey implicitly a discriminatory message. Even though these values are loyalty, unity, and social cohesion, and in our Western culture, we assume to be values, quite neutral values. So, but I am quite sympathetic with the idea that behind this neutrality, there might be a discriminatory impact. Where I get lost in your paper is when you start referring to, you make a series of quite bold assumptions, such as migrants and particularly Muslims are incompatible with these national values, or you draw from these the implication that even after the pledge, there is suspicion about the commitment of Muslims to those national values, or that this suspicion legitimizes an escalation of surveillance and public scrutiny. What's, if I may, what's the ground for this assumption? It seems to me that there is a conflation between different levels of analysis, the legal, the sociological, the security related. So I would like to learn more about it. And then lastly, Sofya, her presentation on the US citizenship ceremonies. You highlight the quite quite contradictory transition from what you call anxiety over potentially disloyal immigrants to the celebration of what you call the immigrant super citizen. And this is a contradiction with what happened with what happens in the dominant public debate, where the anti-immigration sentiment is in fact particularly strong after 9/11. So this contradiction is explained in your paper by claiming that naturalization ceremony speeches, I quote, could simply be ascribed to the purpose of inherent in these ceremonies to enact a symbolic crossing of citizenship boundary. I agree on the symbolic argument. I would wish you could expand more on this. I mean, my sense is that I mean, my question, I wonder, let's put it this way, I wonder whether this symbolism involves a distinction between the bad immigrant who ultimately can or should be expelled, and the good citizen, the good immigrant who is ready to become a good citizen because of his or her commitment to national values. I think this is something that might become more relevant in the debate now, precisely because there is this anti-immigration sentiment, and the distinction between good and bad immigrants might become more crucial. I stop here. Thank you very much once again for your wonderful presentations.
Thank you, Mario. So maybe Bridget will start.
Yes, so did Daniela have a question? Although I have to say I have to leave very soon. I'm having a meeting with a senior colleague to ask them for money, so it's impolitic to be late.
No problem, I can wait. I can wait.
Okay. So yeah, I like you was very interested in the absence of reference to the EU, which was a major benefit at the time of getting citizenship, that people would, because Britain wasn't in the Schengen agreement, travel within the EU was really quite difficult for those without a British passport. And I think the explanation I would have for it was just that even at that time, European membership was controversial, and that these ceremonies tend to avoid anything that's controversial, and also that the point of the ceremony is to focus on the national, and that somehow, as we've seen in Brexit, there is a sense that the membership of the EU is somehow undermining of the national, which was a kind of, you know, motivation behind, or one of the motivations behind the exit. The question of the local, I mean, I think it's interesting. I was really fascinated by Anne's discussion of the ways in which the ceremonies are controlled, because that really is quite different from the UK. And in a way, the difference is surprising, because the UK, I don't see it as having a very strong devolved local governance, which would support the free for all. So it was curious to me that those local welcomes, there was no prescription on what should happen, apart from the oath was the only thing that was dictated. And in fact, there was a video that circulated of a kind of model ceremony, because the registrars didn't know what to do, so they thought they'd come up with it. So it was very uncontrolled, and I think I don't really have an explanation for it, because I think it's unusual in a way in the British context that there was such lack of care over it. But yeah, I haven't really answered your questions very well, but sorry about that. But I'm very sorry that I have to leave, but yeah, I have to obey the clock and my senior colleague.
Many thanks,
Thank you.
Bridget. I'll see you soon, maybe.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, bye. Now, maybe Anne or Sofya, I don't know, who wish to answer.
I'm happy to go, but did Daniela, I'm not sure what format do you want to put all the questions out and then we'll go for it, or shall I answer the questions that are already out?
Yeah, perhaps we can collect all the questions and then allow Anne and Sofia to deal with them on the aggregate.
Okay, then I guess it's my turn. Right? Okay. First of all, let me thank both the speakers and of course also Bridget that just left for their tremendously interesting presentations. I really enjoyed. And of course, as Mario anticipated, my focus is on borders. So my question for you both would be if and how the evolution of border management in your respective legal orders, and namely the adoption of narratives of prevention and coercion, has affected citizens' ceremonies and their significance. So I would like to know whether we can draw a linkage between, you know, the way in which border management has been shaped and reshaped, and the way in which citizens' ceremonies are conducted. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniela.
Yeah, it's not a legal question. It's more, I would say, emotional one, because unfortunately Bridget left us. But I just wanted to ask you if, especially Sofia, because you paid attention also to the different speeches in different moments. Did you notice any differences in these welcome speeches according to the origin of the new citizen? I mean, here in Europe, more and more we are experiencing differences between those who are migrants and those who are expat. So I was arguing if you, in your studies, somehow encountered some of these very maybe slightly differences in the approach. And this is my only question. Switching to the Italian citizenship, I never, like Mario, attended to a ceremony in Italy, but I noticed that in Italy, because I studied the citizenship in Italy, we don't pay that big attention to ceremony. We don't pay attention to tests before becoming an Italian citizen. We just recently introduced the possibility to undergo to an Italian language knowledge test, which is a middle level. So I think that the experiences that you are showing us are typical of states who have a huge past of immigration. I mean, you are all representing countries where immigration is really a strong part of the history. The Italian law regulating citizenship, I think it's really affected by the fact that Italy has not this strong history of immigration. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you to you, Manuela. So maybe now we got all questions. We can leave the floor to our guest. Please, Anne. You have to open your microphone.
Yes, I do, don't I? I actually did press the button, but it didn't work. So I was just saying, Flora, I might start then with your question, because I think it actually feeds into some of my responses to the others. And I heard you ask whether you thought that the citizenship ceremonies was a step towards integration, or whether in fact it was kind of happening, I don't have the words to describe it, but sort of after the fact. And I would say it's well after the fact. I think the conditions for naturalization are such that they're so extensive that those candidates have already demonstrated that they are effectively Australian in all but actually having attended the ceremony. So they've lived here for 5 years. They do a test now since 2007, modelled on the US one. We were very taken by that. we have a language, so, and that doubles as our language test as well, even though we don't have a national language. There's no requirement, but we claim that English is our national language, despite no law ever being anywhere sort of saying that. So I think it's the only opportunity, it's the only time where migrants on a larger scale, both in terms of grouped together, but also for a wide national public, demonstrate that they've already integrated in that kind of way. And so I do think there is something about the technology of reassurance that is in play, but I don't think that is necessarily, as I said in the paper, every part of it. And in fact, I haven't thought about it, but perhaps there's a technology of anxiety and insecurity as well. But anyway, that's another thing. Sofya, we can do a tag team, and maybe you might like to respond to a question and then we can take it in turn so you don't hear me for too long.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, sure. I actually wanted to start with Manuela's excellent question about the difference in the way that expats versus migrants are treated. I did see that. It was very interesting. So overall, like, these ceremonies tend to be extremely diverse in terms of country of origin. So there is not like necessarily a ceremony where there's a predominance of any one origin. And I also know that because in almost every ceremony, there is a element where they call every country that is present, the origin country, and that person stands up. So it is another way, it's like a graduation, at least in the US context, that also happens, being called by name. But this is where the difference comes in. When there are Europeans from, particularly if someone British or French or Italian, there's a lot of excitement. Like, even the way they will say the country is like, they will pause and emphasize it, like it is extra special, like it is, yeah. And then they often in these ceremonies, they will ask a new citizen to come up and do the Pledge of Allegiance, which is different from the Oath of Allegiance. It's where you pledge allegiance to the flag after you become a citizen. And they really love getting the Europeans for that. So if there is like a French person getting naturalized, that for sure will be the person that's up there with their French accent doing the Pledge of Allegiance. So there is this a very interesting dynamic that happens there. Then we can reflect on what that means in the U.S. culture's veneration of our colonial past. I hope that answered the question, and I'll pass it back to you before I go on.
Thanks, that's really interesting. I have actually observed a couple of citizenship ceremonies in the UK, and they did a similar thing where they called out people from particular countries and their names and linked it to that. I've not seen that happen in the Australian context, but at most, sometimes they'll have a list, they might read out a list of countries that people are here coming from, but they'll never put that to an individual person, as far as I'm aware. I mean, it's possible, but I haven't seen that as a practice. Which I think is interesting. I guess another way of deferring that cultural diversity, you can recognise it, but it's very clear it takes a backseat to looking forward into these neutral liberal values of the Australian state, I guess. And maybe that is a good segue to start to address Mario's excellent questions. So I didn't speak so much in my presentation about Australian values, although that's something that the government is increasingly linking to citizenship and the acquisition of citizenship status. These are people who hold Australian values. That's quite complicated because, and it probably is everywhere, because it's very difficult to say what Australian values are. Also because we're a nation of diverse people with many different values. So what exactly does that mean? They have linked it to the pledge. So, and the words I read out. So Australian values are commitment to democracy, loyalty to the nation, and obedience to the law. And they do sound very neutral, non-discriminatory, except that, and look, I accept that the shift to that part of the paper, I am drawing upon not so much legal scholarship, but the sociological scholarship that's been undertaken in Australia that talks about how that in the Australian context, there are groups of migrants who, it's not my view, I have to say, I mean, I hope that's clear for at least in the article, but that certain groups of migrants are represented as anti-democratic or represented as particularly likely to break the law, law breakers. And they, for a variety of reasons, have been associated more often with those from Arabic backgrounds and Muslim backgrounds. Now, this isn't just since 9/11 either, although that did give it a fair boost of fuel. So Australia was alongside the US in its in-gate conflict with Iraq in the 80s, and there was a considerable discrimination against Lebanese and of which Australia has quite a number of migrants coming from. Christians mostly, actually, but they were grouped together in that context. And of course, we're very close to Indonesia, who has a very high Islamic population. So this can be contrasted with the other, quite another significant group of migrants to Australia, which are generally grouped together as our Asian community, who have a different set of assumptions. Again, not my research, but is quite extensively studied, who are considered to be more compliant migrants. So less likely to be the rule breakers and less likely to be anti-democratic. So they, while there are other dynamics at play, which don't necessarily mean that they're necessarily warmly embraced, it has a different set of factors to, I think, the Muslim population, although that, of course, is not just their religious association, that's also a racial, cultural and religious mishmash of associations in a particular cultural context. So, and I guess the work of Edward Said kind of really informs my work on that, what I draw upon to use it for. So yeah, so that's kind of where that bit of the paper came from. Admittedly, it could well have been more developed, so I don't deny.
I take it you're throwing the ball back to me, Anne. This actually makes me think about Flora's question about the relationship between citizenship and integration. And actually for my book, The Road to Citizenship, I examined how immigrants themselves understood this transition. So I interviewed immigrants going through the process. And from a lot of their perspective, it was like it was a legal landmark in their lives, but it was, you know, it was a piece of paper that came usually after and unrelatedly to markers of integration that they valued, which were living in the community, working, raising children, or sometimes participating in various, you know, civic organizations, is how they understood belonging in the US. And also a lot of, this is not just my research, but in my research also, people point out that after I come out of the ceremony, I'm not going to have citizen written on my forehead. So if I am racialized as a foreigner in the United States or as a terrorist in the United States, that is not going to really change my day-to-day experience living here, right? And so you know, in the case of actually Asian immigrants and in the United States, you know, there's a forever foreigner syndrome that accompanies the model minority. And so, like, you know, even regardless of what generation you are, you're always perceived as a foreigner. And, you know, as tensions with China escalate, and this is also not new, you know, this historical, you know, cycles of this, there's also a lot of suspicion of Asian immigrants being spies, right, or not truly loyal. So, yeah, all this to say there's a gap between the legal status and the everyday experience. And there's also denaturalization. So legally for 10 years after you become a citizen as a foreign-born person, you can be stripped of citizenship. You know, this has historically been used in the United States, you know, throughout the 20th century on political dissidents in very large numbers. And a few years ago, the US government formed a new office of denaturalization to escalate them again. And denaturalizations do happen, and sometimes to political dissidents, including Palestinian activists who live in the United States. I guess I'll jump to Mario's point about the distinction between good and bad immigrant. Yeah, I think that is key to the pattern that I was seeing, the historical shift to the super citizen discourse that is so at odds with reality of the immigration system. And it's almost like it's so, you know, superlative because of the terrible things that are happening and that everybody's seeing at the same time. But I also think, like, to think about the United States in a global context, throughout the US history, kind of the treatment of oppressed minority groups was at different points of liability in geopolitics, you know, thinking about the treatment of African Americans in the mid-20th century, at the same time as trying to leverage influence over decolonizing nations that are, you know, in Africa and Latin America that are establishing their independence and liberation. And some of the policies internally in the United States were shaped by this kind of pressure to not look like a totally, you know, like white supremacist, you know, fascist country that it was. And some of what's happening with that's happening to immigrants is happening here as well, in these very public ceremonies, public spectacles projected to the world of, like, look, all these people are really, really wanting to be part of us, and we're, you know, this is a great place to be, like, so I think that there's that dynamic as well. All right, and I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Sofya. And we have Daniela's question as well, which we haven't yet to come to. So, so your question, I'm not sure. I know a little, so it'll be a bit of a guess. I have to say, I haven't. It's a very good question, and one that I'll have to think more about. Australia's border. We have some similarities with the US in that we have had a very anti-refugee, anti-asylum seeker discourse for now quite some time. So at least since the 2000s, if not probably a little earlier than that. And this real distinction between those who arrive improperly or illegally and those who wait in the queue, who do it in an orderly fashion, who are prioritised and who are represented as more deserving. That said, Australia's treatment has been, you might know it, it's pretty horrible. It basically sets off offshore refugee camps. So anyone who arrives, often by boat, will be diverted before usually they reach the shore to places in the Pacific or in Papua New Guinea, and potentially forever. Because the other rule it has is that if you stop at another country on your way to Australia, Australia will send you back to that third country rather than send you. So it's kind of in a tangled web. In relation to citizenship, though, And the ceremonies in particular, I think, what do I think about that? I think that the connection, if it's there, is around, I suppose, state reassertion of control. I think there is a parallel over the citizen, you do what I say, and we can do whatever we like, and the same over refugees. So you come when we say. So I think there is perhaps some parallel, but I think they do, and perhaps this is a technique of the government to distinguish them and put them into different groups. So for a person who arrives illegally, they may have changed the law, but recently you could never become an Australian citizen because you've breached the Migration Act, which means you can never become an Australian citizen. So it sort of, you have these nested boxes of borders that push irregular migrants, I hate that term, but as far away from accessing the Australian community as possible, as distant, and then if you're a good resident who applies the law, who has a visa for 10 years, who does all these things, does everything that the state asks, well then yes, maybe. But even ultimately then, if you tick all the boxes, it's still ultimately up to the minister's discretion to allow you to be a citizen or not. So they could just say no for no reason, and there's no appeal. So Australia keeps its sovereignty very close to its chest, at least recently, also.
Right. So in the US context, and Danielle, thank you for the excellent question about border management. Yeah, I think I would say that in these ceremonies and in the speeches of these ceremonies, there is an attempt, like Anne pointed out, to kind of separate groups of migrants into different boxes, which really is a myth and belies the reality that, for example, in the US, more than half of undocumented migrants are visa overstayers. So they came to the United States legally on a visa, and then they just stayed after the visa expired. That's more than half. And then a huge proportion of permanent legal residents who become citizens have experienced spells of illegality during their time in the United States. So these categories are very false. But the role of the ceremonies is to maintain the myth of law and order, and to kind of juxtapose the good immigrants that are getting naturalized to the chaos at the border. So the border is almost kind of implicit and invisible in these ceremonies because what happens there doesn't apply to these good immigrants. Right, so it's like a way to perpetuate those myths and hide the violence that undergirds the entire system and that affects most immigrants across the different statuses.
Thank you very much. If I can just add something. So if I understand correctly, the rationale is that if you enter irregularly, you have this original sin. And as a matter of fact, in consequence of this, you don't deserve to have a citizen ceremony, right? You don't deserve to have access to this process of integration through naturalization. Is this the right way to understand your points?
In Australia, I'd have to check the law. It may have changed recently, but that certainly was when I last checked about 5 years ago. So, yeah.
Yeah, in the US, that's certainly the discourse. Although if you're a visa overstayer, you're in much more advantaged position in terms of your very slim, chances of becoming a regularized are much better than someone who crossed the border who has like the original sin. It's true.
Thank you very much.
Just on that, I was just going to say on that, in Australia, the technique has been to send the overstayer outside of Australia before they're being given their visa, so then they come back in. But of course, once they're out of Australia, because they breached the immigration law to start with, they're much less likely to ever be able to get a second one to come back in again. So, yeah.
So, okay, I think that it's really time to stop. I really much enjoyed this cross answering between Sofya and Anne. Many thanks for your generous answers and your rich presentations. We traveled across your different legal system, cultural and social approach. And maybe Manuela, we could be we are certainly inspired by this line of research, and we could imagine to launch surveys also within the Italian system, and maybe meet again and organize a big conference to examine together our data. Okay, so I don't know if Mario wants to add a final word. Otherwise,
just to thank our distinguished guests for this enriching discussion. I'm glad to hear that Flora is going to carry out a research on the Italian side, let's say, and so it's a goodbye. We will meet very soon again to discuss the conclusions that Flora will reach with her new research. Thank you very much for your generosity and kindness. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you all to you too. It's lovely to meet you.
And thank you to the participants.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.